Ken Brazel. I'm with the Arkansas Natural Resources Commission. And for years we were the Soil and Water Conservation Commission, and we got calls that people were trying to get NRCS back when they were the Soil Conservation Service. And today we still get calls of people trying to get NRCS, and they're calling the state office. But I was asked to talk to y'all about the Gulf of Mexico Hypoxia or Watershed Nutrient Task Force. I think it's actually called the Hypoxia Task Force now. There's been a few iterations of names, and I couldn't begin to tell you the political thought behind changing the name, but somebody's, I guess, spending time thinking about what plays better. Has anybody even heard of that or heard of Gulf of Mexico Hypoxia?
Notice the Agricultural Council of Arkansas in their recent e-letter just said reports are larger than ever. Is that right?
Yes. That group has was basically set up and was convened in 1997, and that was EPA's response to some complaints and I guess some threats of legal lawsuits or that from some folks down on the lower end in Louisiana, from some commercial fishermen interest, and also other folks concerned about the Gulf of Mexico health in general. But basically, nutrients come down the Mississippi River. They go into the Gulf during the summer when the Gulf is not mixing, depending on the weather. Then you get a lot of nutrients that create, through the process of decomposition, create a lot of oxygen demand in the water, and therefore the dissolved oxygen in the water goes down, and this affects marine life. EPA's approach at the time was, as opposed to, you know, trying to come up with some regulatory mandate, decided to convene on a voluntary basis states to get together and federal agencies to talk about the problem, what they could do about it. And Arkansas was actually at attendance in the first meeting. Our former director, Randy Young, attended the first meeting, and there were 4 or 5 states, I think, represented during the first meeting that they had. And over time, since then, it has evolved and has just about every department in the federal government that has anything to do with land or water resources is involved. And then as well, on the state level, you've got states that pretty much adjoin the river, Mississippi main stem, all the way from Wisconsin to Louisiana, and then some that are on the Ohio that don't directly abut up to the Mississippi. And there's a few other states that kind of hit or miss, but these are kind of the states that have been participating over the years. Basically, this is a measurement of the hypoxic zone this year, and the Mississippi River is actually over here, but due to the Gulf Stream and the way the currents are in the Gulf, if you know anything about that, it more or less stretches that hypoxic plume in the way it is there along the Louisiana coast and then westward over into Texas. And this year, check me if I'm wrong, Mike, but I think it was about 20,000 kilometers, and the goal that they're trying to achieve is a 5,000 kilometer aerial extent. And they have folks that go out every year and measure that on a boat from the LSU researchers there go out and they measure this every year, and so there's a running tab of, you know, the aerial extent. They try to, you know, measure about the same time every year, and it kind of fluctuates, so they you know, calculate a 5-year average, and you know, depending on if we've had a really wet spring, you get a big flush, as you would imagine. You get a lot of nutrient input, and the zone is generally larger. In the years when you've got a much drier spring, then typically the zone is not as big. And then what happens is, depending on the weather, if you get a hurricane that goes through and helps mix up the Gulf, you know, and the stratification in the water depth, and you mix that up, and then eventually when the winter rolls around and you get a little more intermixing of that, then this thing kind of goes away. So the primary concern, I think, is in the, you know, is in the summer months when it's the worst.
What's ideal? I noticed if you, on that slide you just had up,
Yeah.
that it's greater than 5 parts. I can't tell what it.
Yeah, the
Milligrams
red
per
is
liter.
like
Okay.
less than 2 milligrams per liter. And I don't know that they said anything ideal. I know for the White River below Bull Shoals and North Fork Dam in Arkansas, the game and fish like to see it over 6 milligrams per liter for the trout, for dissolved oxygen. So, you know, that's something I'm not sure they've ever really discussed. That's a great question. I can't believe in the whole time that.
I mean, red's not always bad. I'm assuming it is in this case, but how bad?
In the yellow is greater than 5.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess they're looking at 5 as maybe being the breakover point, or above 5 is less critical. The red is less than 2.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know what the actual dissolved oxygen that starts affecting the marine life. I know I've read that in the past, and I just can't remember off the top of my head. I apologize.
That's
for
okay.
that.
I'm sure it's a range, but
Yeah.
I mean, I'm assuming all that's colored in is below the desired levels of oxygen content. But
Yeah.
wondered how that related to the norm in the Gulf.
Right. It looks to be around 5 or so, seems to be what they're calling what they consider to be a depleted to level to you know, map it. You know, the group, this thing has gone through a lot of iterations of just administrative processes, and they've leveraged, you know, the scientific council to do research and various things about what it would take to shrink this aerial extent down to the 5,000 square kilometers. And they came out with, this was a second iteration of an action plan. Then they did some reassessments since then, and the National Academy of Sciences came out with a report that recommended that they needed 40% reduction of load into the Gulf, both for nitrogen and phosphorus. And there was a goal, they wanted to achieve this goal by the year 2015, the 5,000 aerial extent, and now they've pushed it to 2035. And one of the things that I think EPA through this process recognized was that they couldn't, this really wasn't a regulatory approach. Initially, I think the states came forward for a couple of reasons to participate on the group. One was find out if they were going to have any money from the federal government to spread out, you know, to have stuff done. And then the second thing was to keep an eye on EPA based on just the general mistrust, I guess, that they weren't going, that at least the states could monitor what was going on. And I think over time, you know, a little bit of trust ensued, I guess, with the folks involved, and EPA essentially said, well, every state's not the same, and some states are further along in this area than others, and so let's push it out to them and let them develop their own nutrient reduction strategies. Which is kind of what I was going to cover a little bit today, and y'all can read these slides, and I'll provide these to Mike, and I'm not going to read through all these, but the basic premise in Arkansas was we have a lot of good things going on. We have existing programs. Let's work on those. Let's strengthen our existing programs. If you look at nutrient loading, you've got two sources, point and non-point. The point sources, think about our effluent from wastewater treatment plants from large urban areas up and down the Mississippi. EPA regulates that through the Clean Water Act, so that's kind of a low-hanging fruit that they could go out and say, okay, we'll require additional unit processes to reduce nutrients in the effluent, you know, nitrogen or phosphorus. But non-point is non-regulatory, and we don't regulate non-point activities. All that is voluntary, and through our agency administers the 319 program, which, you know, we go into a watershed and offer money for either projects or implementing best management practices, and that's all on a voluntary basis. So that's essentially what our strategy was based around, was the voluntary participation. Some states have chosen to set some interim target goals where they went in and for every watershed they said we're going to have a X% of reduction of nutrient loading. Up to this point, Arkansas has chosen not to do that. There are a lot of challenges scientifically, number one, in measuring changes in water quality. Even if you've spent a lot of effort in a watershed, you know intuitively that land is being managed better, but maybe there's a few areas that are not being managed as well. And so if you're monitoring at some point down here on the stream, you may not see a whole lot of changes in water quality, but you know you've implemented a lot of best management practices. And over the long haul, probably all that land will be managed better cumulatively, and you'll eventually see, you know, that will show up in the water quality, but immediately you may not see anything. So we, you know, Arkansas has chosen not to set those percentage reduction goals, and then also that keeps you from somebody saying, well, you know, you set a goal of 25% reduction by this date and now you haven't met that, so now you failed and this has not been, you know, it's been a total failure. So I think those are some of the considerations that went into our nutrient reduction strategy. And again, these are basically promote, here's one here that's been talked about a lot today, which was the whole farm planning, which was the vernacular a couple of years ago, and now I think it's more, John, a holistic planning, but I think that was the term, or similar terms representing the same concept, to look at how you're managing a farm. And you know, EPA had commissioned the USGS to do all these models and basically look at the whole Mississippi River Basin, and this being dark is where you have higher loading, and I think this one, I don't remember if this is phosphorus or nitrogen, but primarily I think the southern states early on assumed that this was basically an issue that was being caused by the Corn Belt in the Midwest. And over time, as they've developed these models and different things, you know, Arkansas is in here somewhere, and there are some areas in Arkansas that we could that show that there is, you know, nutrient loading coming from. But we don't have any water quality standards at the state level for nutrients, so, or we don't have any impairment on the 303D list of impaired waters that are impaired to nutrients. They're generally tied to sediment, which is related to nutrients in some respect. But the priority watersheds was one thing we needed to do, and that was in our plan, and that was based on a lot of folks that were involved in some of our non-point stakeholder group processes. And essentially out of that, looking at all different kinds of factors, water quality being one of them, to come up with those priority watersheds. And those priority watersheds were really designated to just look at targeting resources wherever they may come from towards putting in those areas to help with nutrient management and nutrient reduction. This is a map from some of the NRCS programs of some of their priorities. And then this was in Arkansas, the Illinois River Basin, where our initial efforts for nutrient reduction had nothing to do with the Gulf of Mexico. It had to do with lawsuits between Oklahoma and Arkansas and the Illinois River Basin in northwest Arkansas. And so initially in the early 90s, Arkansas put all of its efforts in nutrient reduction and nutrient management in that part of the state, and all of the legislation and things we have related to nutrient management and surplus nutrient areas are up in the northwest part of the state. And there was a suggestion from our out of our 2014 state water plan update to make the same requirements statewide as far as that we have in the nutrient surplus areas, which are if you're going to apply litter or nutrients in whatever form, that you have a nutrient management plan, you have licensed applicators, and some training, and that hasn't gone anywhere, but someone has been thinking about that. I don't want to get too far afield. I'll just make some general comments about how the Gulf of Mexico task force has related to supporting efforts that are ongoing and things like this workshop and actual practices on the ground. It's represented a regulatory agency, and depending on how you look at it, some would say have pushed the bounds of regulation in some respects. But this effort, in my mind, has been where they have seen the obvious value in trying to coordinate a non-regulatory approach. And so a lot of things have happened, not that the individuals on the task force have done, but collectively the federal government, primarily EPA, the Department of Agriculture, the Department of Interior, have actually tried to coordinate a little better. And I know the Mississippi River Basin Initiative, which funded a lot of money through NRCS, and our state conservationist in Arkansas did a tenure within NRCS for a few years where he was the liaison for this effort. So he was very much involved in this task force in Mississippi River in general for several years. So when he became the state conservationist in Arkansas, Arkansas did very well when USDA pushed out the initial allocated money throughout the country for EQIP and their other conservation programs. Arkansas did extremely well through all of that. So that's something I see that's been a direct result. Is they've also been at the front of trying to push the science through some of the research institutions up north, but they've also done research here, and I think one of the researchers is on the agenda tomorrow from a research center up in northeast Arkansas. Michelle Reba will be out on y'all's tour, I think, tomorrow. So they have helped push the research and science. They've also tried to make inroads with the corporate side as well, and and both on the education and research, the science, advancement of science, but also on market-driven, incentives, sustainability, that type of stuff. So I think the the task force overall has been a good forum to just collectively try to push that so that we do better practices that are sustainable and make sense for the individuals who are managing our land and water resources. Like John alluded to, let's don't go out and tell people what they need to do. Let's figure out what objectives we need to achieve and then what's the best way we can do things. So the last thing I'll say here in Arkansas is one of the things that we've been big on is water management and water use, meeting the total water demand in some of the areas of East Arkansas where we have depleting groundwater aquifers. And so a lot of those water conservation measures and things that have been referenced in the earlier presentation, tailwater recovery and better management of when water is applied and getting it more efficiently distributed evenly and only what's needed across the agricultural landscape. All of those are things that our commission has been promoting for decades, and they weren't really related to reducing nutrients to the Gulf of Mexico, but maintaining water and managing it better on the at the individual farm level does reduce and help reduce runoff of sediments, and therefore the nutrients that are tied to those sediments, and therefore is, maybe for a different reason, do have nutrient reduction values. So and a lot of states are doing things that are working because everybody pretty much has the same issues with managing water and managing their sediment and nutrients. They're different landscapes, so they require different maybe individual techniques depending on what part of the country you're in. But overall, the task force has been in place to help support, whatever is working in those states. And like I say, there's been a lot of stuff in Arkansas and other places where they've gotten people out and either demonstrate different techniques or things or try to get the education and stuff out, and just like this, try to reach the technical people that are providing services to landowners and also the vendors, the fertilizer industry, things of that nature. We are in the process in Arkansas of updating our strategy. I'm not exactly sure what that means. I'm involved in that. I'm just kind of being drug along to see where that goes. But I think the biggest thing for us is, and on the task force now, is how are the states reporting out the good progress that they're making, and so that they can show when people ask, well, what are you doing? We need to regulate people because nothing's happening. There's a way, if it's not just directly water quality, what are the ways we can report success? And as you know, with any change, you're going to have early adopters, people who are a little bit more forward thinking or are in a better position either financially or otherwise to try new things. And as those things are seen, whether they prove out or not, if they prove out, then eventually those things kind of become the norm. And so there's a natural process that has to occur. So there's not just, you can't just say, okay, y'all need to do this and we're going to reduce nutrients and the thing in the Gulf of Mexico. If y'all would just try harder, this will go away and we'll have it fixed. It gets down to the grassroots individually. And so I think there has been some recognition of that over the years of people involved at EPA, even though their people change out. There seems to be and then with the new administration, I guess everybody's kind of waiting to see with a little bit of the pendulum swinging the other way of not being so heavy and maybe a laxation of regulation, how that would translate into just a regulatory community at large. I don't think it's going to affect this effort very much because, like I say, this effort primarily for the non-point is all voluntary. You've got to get people to either voluntarily participate in government programs or on their own implement things that provide benefits and we get better water quality. So, any questions?
I guess I have a couple. So,
Sure.
You know, when you say, oh, okay, you know, we want to be able to show back to, you know, to EPA and to Congress and I guess to the public as a whole that, yeah, okay, the ag community in Arkansas is making some progress here. So I get why, you know, it makes sense that you don't necessarily want to tie that kind of outcome metric directly to water quality monitoring. But is there a good way for a farmer to know that, okay, you know, the changes I might make on my farm, you know, that's going to be, you know, EPA is going to know that and see that and see that as part of the progress? Or is that part of what you're working on putting together still?
I think that's part of there's some various subcommittees that are, you know, when these task force decides they need to address an issue, and there's been a subcommittee on primarily non-point pollution and reporting. How do we report progress? What type of measures can we maybe use? Are there any measures we can standardize among all the states that we can report back on? And so I would say that they have some frameworks that they're going to be, that they've daylighted a little bit to the task force, and they've already done one for point source and kind of produced a report on that of kind of a measures and how we're going to measure and track progress. And like I say, that's kind of the low-hanging fruit because you have lots of data about end-of-pipe effluent and existing permits that they can go in and do a lot of statistics and say, okay, if we ratchet back and get the city of Chicago to get their effluent down to a certain level, we know that's going to translate into a fairly definable reduction in concentration and therefore loading. Since the non-point is a little more tricky, so I guess to answer the question, yes, that's in the process, that's in the works. That has been being discussed for the last couple of years of how best to represent that. Because I think that is the message, that early on there was an assumption that, well, the nutrient thing is all on ag and, you know, somebody's got to be a bad guy. And I think, at least at this point, my involvement is that it's no longer about who's a bad guy. It's there are a lot of different contributing factors. Either John or one of talked about, you know, if we totally cut off all nutrient contribution from any watershed in the whole Mississippi River Basin, no one has any idea what's going to show up in the Gulf. If it's going to stay the same for the next 30 years, if we had 100% reduction in nutrients. So there's a lot of challenges associated with just the science and making a straight calculation to say that if everybody got 40% reduction on nitrogen and phosphorus for every 8-digit watershed, what would we actually see down at the Gulf as far as the change in the hypoxia? So I think all of the stuff that's recommended in reporting has to be done in recognition of there's still a lot of unknowns out there. I guess you're more reporting of what the ag community is doing. I think that message with USDA's representation on the task force, that's pretty much their lobby, is to show we're putting considerable resources into better management practices, and the farming or agricultural community, whether it's livestock or row cropping, are taking advantage of those programs and best management practices that we have financial support to implement. So I think that is a measuring stick.